Hello everybody, welcome. It's lovely to be here. Just start by telling you a little bit about myself. So obviously we're here tonight to talk about sensory processing differences in children with autism. So my name's Jan Forward. I'm a children's occupational therapist. I qualified in 1987, very long time ago. And about 12 years ago, I decided to move from social care into the NHS. So to do that, you needed to do this blooming American thing called sensory training. And I thought, oh, well, I'll give it a whirl. Anyway, became a sensory integration addict and it was life-changing. And it's given me a real understanding. When I was doing my training, because I was working in social care, I actually had to do some research with a case study. And I used my dad, who had dementia. And we used sensory strategies with my dad. And I always firmly maintain that we kept neural pathways open with him. So we were very lucky that he knew us until he died. So I think being able to understand sensory processing and being able to use sensory strategies is something that is applicable to every generation and across lifespan. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation today. We've only got 50 minutes and I can comfortably talk for 500, so I need to just be a bit mindful and not witter on too much. Some of the PowerPoint will be available to you afterwards. So some of the slides have got a lot of information on them and I obviously won't read all of that, but what I will do is just make sure that that way you've got that information, which is why we've left it in. So let's start. So the idea of today is to give you information about sensory processing, and you live with it on a day-to-day basis with your children. So you probably know as much as I do, you just don't have it in a theoretical way that I do. And I learn an awful lot from working with parents and children. Just the other thing to tell you a little bit about me and my job. I work for Provide. I work as part of the SEND team. We work with children who've got sensory approaches within their education and healthcare plans. And I also do a lot of tribunal assessments. So that's my current role. And so I was asked to do this presentation and here I am. But my big passion is it's about education because, as I say on my next slide, education is power. And if we can help you to help your child to understand how their sensory processing is different and how it impacts on everyday life, then as they grow up, they develop their own strategies and cope with life moving into adulthood. And if you talk to a lot of adults with autistic spectrum disorder that do sort of public speaking and things, they will talk about their strategies and they are just neurodiverse. And actually the world needs to adjust to people with sensory processing difficulties. Okay, so our objectives today are to help you to understand how the sensory world feels to your child and also to help you to begin to recognise what the sensory basis of some of the behaviours are and to give you some basic tools for sensory strategies. The toolbox is quite detailed in the PowerPoint presentation and quite a lot of it is listed. So you'll be able to sort of work through that afterwards and get some tools rather than me running through it. So what is sensory processing? Sensory processing is a three-stage process that is ongoing 24/7 for all of us. It starts with a sensory input, sensory receptors. I've just got my little notes here. Sensory input, you've got your sensory receptors are stimulated. That might be by the smell of a perfume or the sound of a bell or the feel of your socks on your feet. That sends a message to your brain. And the brain then processes that information and organises it, and then it produces a response. And that response then produces another sensory input. So it's cyclical. And one thing just to say is when you are in the United Kingdom, we don't say sensory processing disorder. It's an expression that's used in America and in other parts of the world, but it isn't recognised under something called the DSM-5, which is the way that the World Health Organization categorises disease. So in the UK, we tend to just say sensory processing difficulties. So if you get told your child's got sensory processing disorder, that's just why. It's just a difference in terminology. The sensory pyramid, I find this a really useful way of understanding the impact of sensory processing on everyday life. So our sensory system is the very bottom. And if you think about, I always like to think of Jenga. If you have a game of Jenga, if the blocks at the bottom are not stable, nothing goes on above, everything just falls over. And it's exactly the same with sensory processing. If your sensory system is not regulated and is not in what we call the just right place, then things like academic learning, being able to organise your body to get yourself washed and dressed, all of those things will be dysfunctional. They won't work in the way you want them to, because basically everything that's underneath, all that sensory processing will impact on the way that we function. And that's, I think, a really useful way of remembering it. So when your child has got sensory difficulties, if you can get that sensory system working by maybe changing the environment or helping the child to learn to cope and use alternative strategies, ear defenders, things like that, then you're more likely to be able to get what you want functionally from the child at the higher levels in that pyramid. I hadn't actually seen this until I borrowed this presentation from one of the other ladies who's running the training today, which was quite funny really, because when I'm doing training, I always talk about when you're dysregulated, it's a bit like being in the central reservation of the M25. And when I'm training, I'll often use that analogy with teaching staff, because if you can imagine, if you put me on a maths lesson today in a classroom, I would be able to focus and learn. If you gave me that same maths lesson but stuck me on the central reservation of the M25, I wouldn't be learning. I would be worrying about whether I was going to get hit by a lorry. Would be worrying about whether the car had come too close. So, and Jean Ayres, she was actually called Anne Jean Ayres, was an occupational therapist, and she was one of the first people that really did a lot of work in the United States about sensory integration, and all the work that we use nowadays predominantly came from her. And she actually said, when the flow of sensations is disorganized, life can be like a rush hour traffic jam. So I should probably use that analogy quite a lot while we're talking today. So sensory integration is the organisation of our senses for use. So I've got bits of paper in the wrong order. And poor integration of the senses interferes with function and prevents the adaptive responses to our environment. And in the autistic spectrum population, sensory integration is known to be a problem that affects everyday life to different levels. Interesting fact, nearly all children with autism have sensory processing difficulties. If you speak to professionals that have done a lot of work with autism, they will tell you that actually they've come across children that have autism, have sensory processing difficulties that don't have autism, but what they haven't come across is children with autism who don't have sensory processing difficulties. So it's in exactly the same way as autism is a spectrum, sensory processing difficulties are a spectrum, and they have different impacts on different children. The other thing is that nearly all children with autistic spectrum disorder have movement difficulties. And as we work through this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the different senses. And my interpretation of it, having done a lot of work with sensory integration over the last 10 years, is that actually, if you've got problems with proprioception, which is about knowing where your body is in space, then of course you're going to have problems with movement and organising yourself. You don't really know what your hands are doing and where they are in relation to your arms, you're not going to be able to easily throw or catch a ball. I wanted to start by showing you this little clip because I think it's really useful. It gives you an understanding of the perspective of a child with autism and how it impacts on sensory processing. So I'm just going to show you this video, she says, hopefully.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Take my hand. It's fine, isn't it? I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
I think that's a really useful video because it shows how something called modulation impacts on the child and everyday life. And if you're here and you have a child with autism, a lot of things about that video might have resonated with you. Sensory processing modulation is about our responses to a sensory input. So when we looked at that slide at the beginning, we had the sensory input and then the processing within the brain and then the sensory response. And modulation is about how we respond. So over or under responsive, over or under responding, we can use the analogy of a sieve. I've also seen therapists use the analogy of a cup, and it works the same way really. Basically, the sensory input comes into the brain, and when the brain processes it, it's like the sieve is either got too many holes and they're too big, or the sieve has got too smaller holes and so the information doesn't get through to the brain. Or in an ideal world, the holes are just the right size and the information is processed in just the right way. So if the holes are too big, then we call this hypersensitivity. And the brain isn't filtering out enough information. Children find it difficult to filter information and they can go into sensory overload. And we can see things like over-responsiveness to sounds. So, for example, a child will be really disturbed by hand dryers. That is the favourite one that we see absolutely all the time. And my own granddaughter doesn't like hand dryers. And when we're out shopping, if we go into a toilet and there's a hand dryer, I just have to reassure her and she copes with that. I've been in situations in a school where a child actually could not be in school because they were so over-responsive to that hand dryer that they couldn't be in the building. It just sent them into a total state of fight or flight and fear and anxiety. You might also see the child that's got tactile hypersensitivity, so they can't wear the labels in their shirts without them being cut out. On the other, so there you go, that's too much information is coming through and too much information is being processed in the brain, and then that sends the brain into overload, which causes the anxiety and the fight or flight response. On the other hand, you might have a child, you will see what we call sensory seeking behaviours, and that is because the holes are too small, and so they'll actually look for information to help them understand the world. I've certainly seen children who will use visual stimming, so they'll be doing this sort of thing as a way of filtering out and seeking extra stimulus to get push that information through the holes in the brain and to help them process. So that is what we call under-responsive. And there we have little bits of information, not enough information going out. It can be quite confusing sometimes because sometimes a child will appear to be hyposensitive, and what it is actually they are hypersensitive. And I've certainly worked with children who were auditory hypersensitive. And funnily enough, I had two children in the same class. One was hyposensitive, one was hypersensitive. But the child that was hypersensitive actually was shut down. So even the slightest auditory stimulus was like a massive thing coming through that sieve, and they would then shut down. So we're going to talk about modulation or alertness. So modulation or alertness is about being in the right place to function. And our alertness needs to be in different places at different times. So, for example, we have EOR down here. That's low arousal and low level modulation. When I finish this talk, I'm going to go for a swim, have a glass of wine, and I will need to be EOR, and that's absolutely fine. If I was sitting here right now talking to you and I was EOR, you would very quickly get bored and fed up. Equally, we have Tigger. We have the over-aroused, on the go, constantly springing about. Children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are often tiggers. Absolutely fine if you're going to a trampoline park, less good if you're trying to do a maths lesson. When we're in that situation, and when we're where we're at now, we need the poo. We need to be in just the right place. And you'll often hear occupational therapists talk about the just right place. And so that's what we're working at. And when you're working with your child, it's really helpful if you can get an idea of whether they're an Eeyore or whether they're a Tigger, and what you can do to help your child to move to being a Winnie the Pooh. Got some sensory responses here, and I thought it might be just very quick, just to talk through them. We're going to talk about the different senses in a little bit, but I thought if we could just whiz through these. So I hate having my hair brushed or cut. That's usually a tactile response in a child that's a bit over-responsive. Children that are very, very tactile can actually feel the cut, so it's like a pain. An under-responsive child won't notice pain, but an over-responsive child will feel sensations. So I've had children describe being in the shower as like being hit with needles. I cry and shield my eyes from bright light is the child that is over-responsive to visual stimuli. I hate being cuddled or tickled, can be a very tough one if your child is like that. That's a child that's over-responsive to tactile stimulation. I walk on my tiptoes. It's a little one that's got proprioceptive difficulties, and we'll talk about proprioception in a minute. Proprioception is about being able to process movement. I complain about tags in my clothing is tactile. I'm a picky eater and resist new foods and textures is also tactile. These are both situations where children are very sensitive to touch, and when it comes to picky eating and new foods, that can be because also the oral tactile. So I've worked with children who are incredibly sensitive and will gag at the sight of certain foods. Poor gross motor skills, so that's poor movement. If a child doesn't really know where their body is in space, as I said earlier, they're really going to struggle with being able to organise movement. Trouble focusing and concentrating and listening. If you're an Eeyore and you're sort of floppy, low, and you're slouched in your chair because actually posturally you're low tone, then you're going to struggle. If you're a Tigger and you're bouncing off the ceiling, you're also going to struggle. A child that chews on everything is often proprioceptive seeking, so they're actually looking for that extra input. Oversensitive to noise and hand dryers, we've talked about a little bit already, that's auditory hypersensitivity. A child that's always smelling people and foods and objects is actually looking for that extra smell to help them to understand the world. Our sensory system, when we see these sensory behaviours, they are always about trying to organise and understand our sensory system so that we can get the right response, that we can be Winnie the Pooh. Think about the senses. We've got the famous 5 that everybody knows: auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory and gustatory. That's the posh names for sight, sound, touch, smell and taste. The other 3 that are really important are the vestibular sense, the proprioceptive sense and interoception. The receptors for the vestibular sense come from the inner ear, and they give us information about where we are in relation to the ground and where our body is and body position is in relation to upright, straight. And it was interesting with my dad when he had dementia, because when I tried to make him stand up, his vestibular sense had been affected. So when I tried to make him stand up straight, he felt like I was pushing him backwards. So you've got receptors in the ear, and they are receptive. They're little hairs and they're right in the inner ear. So when you get an ear infection, you get problems with balance. That's because those little hairs have been affected by infection. And you can, they will give us some information about whether it's rotational vestibular movement or whether it's just what we call linear vestibular, which is forwards and back, like swinging. Proprioception is movement, and it gives us some information about muscles contracting, about how much force we're giving. If you close your eyes and touch your nose, that's your proprioceptive receptors working, and our proprioceptive receptors are in our muscles and our joints. Sometimes we see children with ASD and they have hypermobility, and hypermobility is where the joints are more bendy, so they're like double jointed. And a lot of children who have got sort of hypermobility and extra joint range get very muddled proprioceptive information. And that can affect absolutely everything. It affects arousal and ability to focus and attend. Interoception is something we didn't know very much about, and we're really learning about now. So interoception is about being able to read body signals. And we do know more and more that actually a lot of children with autism have difficulties with interoception. So a lot of children with autism will have problems around recognizing when they're full, recognizing when they're hungry. I certainly have children who don't recognize when they're thirsty, which then has massive implications. When you've got a child that's a picky eater because they're tactile sensitive, it's really problematic if on top of that they don't actually recognise when they're hungry and they don't recognise that they need to drink. And obviously all of this can then impact on your bowel function and your bladder function, which can add to the problems. The other thing is, right now I'm sitting here and I'm a little bit nervous, and so my heart is pacing a little bit faster, my skin's a little bit clammy, and I can recognise that, and I know it's because I'm moving towards Tigger. But if you don't understand and you can't read those sensations, then it can sometimes mean that our interpretation of our own emotions is affected. And if you can't interpret your own emotions, it's going to be really, really hard to understand anyone else's. So I've got so auditory hypersensitivity, we've talked about a little bit about already. So with children that are auditory hypersensitive, that's probably the most obvious one to spot. I'm just going to put the notes here. That's the easiest one to spot as a parent, because that's the one that's most likely to be something that you'll see. You see the child covering their ears, becoming very distressed by a car going past, a fire alarm going off. In the video, we saw the young man, and we also saw how his perception of the coins, you and I probably wouldn't have even noticed those coins being dropped. But for a child that is auditory hypersensitive, it will sound like that they've literally been dropped from a great height and made a lot of noise. So you'll see the child covering their ears and that sort of thing. And so auditory hypersensitivity is quite an easy one to see and understand. It also helps then to be able to take use compensatory strategies to try and help. So there's some suggestions, and as I say, the PowerPoint will be available at the end. So ear defenders, MP3 player, things like that. When you're using strategies, the school has a responsibility to make reasonable adjustments for sensory processing difficulties. So if your school ever says to you, we don't have ear defenders here, that's not acceptable. Ear defenders are a reasonable adjustment. When you're using strategies for any form of sensory processing difficulty, always try and think about what's practical for you, what's going to work with your family, and most important, what's acceptable and good for the child. I was on the train yesterday with my granddaughter, and we went into the tube, and it was very, very noisy. And so she had the headphones on. She was quite happy with that. She was accepting with that. She's only 5. If she'd been 15 and I'd produced a pair of ear defenders, she might have found that less acceptable. And then you need to find alternative strategies. If a strategy is not something that the child's happy with, they're not going to engage with it, and then it's not going to work. If the child's auditory hyposensitive, that's the one that might get them into trouble for ignoring the teacher at school. It's the child that's hyposensitive might not necessarily be able to work out what's foreground and background noise. They might struggle with actually hearing, and sometimes we'll hear that children have been for hearing tests because people have thought that they had a hearing impairment. They do have a hearing impairment. They have an auditory processing difficulty, and there are places to get advice and support. I think the NHS has got a few auditory processing centres around, and your OT might well be able to help you with advice on your child if you think that they've got an auditory processing difficulty. Strategies to support, there's a list of strategies there, and they'll be available for you to look at the end. Just a bit mindful of the time. So there's some pictures of suggestions. Always remember age appropriate, and it must be acceptable to the child. Visual hypersensitivity, this is obviously where the child is, the siev's too big, there's too much information going into the brain. So this child, the child that's visual hypersensitive, will be the one that really struggles in the supermarket, really struggles in the classroom. And when you go into classrooms, teachers have got this habit of literally filling every wall with every last centimetre with pictures. And for a child that's got an autistic spectrum disorder problem where there's visual processing hypersensitivity, they're not going to be able to shut out all that visual information and focus on learning. When you're at home, it's really useful to have a quiet space, or and certainly to be mindful when you're thinking about bedrooms and how bedrooms are organised. If you want to get your child down to Eeyore and the bedroom is full of a lot of toys and visual stimulation, lots of pictures on the wall, that will really impact on how the child settles and gets ready for bed. So just be a bit mindful of that in your home environment. Okay, there's some strategies there, and they'll be available for you to print off at the end. If you think your child has got visual hypersensitivity, in fact any sensory processing problem, it's really important to make sure that you work alongside the school SENCO and make sure that the school understand. There are things like workstations that can be set up for children. I've been in a classroom, worst case scenario, with a little boy who was at the back of a class of 35 children, and he was next to a bookshelf, and there was things from the ceiling, every last inch of clutter on the walls, pictures everywhere, and he literally spent the whole lesson trying to shut out some of that information. There was absolutely no way he was going to be able to sit and focus and learn. So it's really important to work with school and try and give them as much information and get information from them too. Hyposensitivity is the opposite. A lot of children who are hyposensitive, that'll be the child that you notice will play with things and just sit and watch them for a long time and get lost in their own space, and that'll be very, very fixated on screens and very keen to sort of focus on the screens, and that's because they're sensory seeking to get all that information. And there's some strategies for visual hypersensitivity. So you might, with the child that is hypersensitive, you might be wanting to work in a darker light environment, whereas if a child's very hyposensitive, you need to get the lighting right up. I think it's really helpful to have that analogy with Eeyore and Tigger. If you've got an Eeyore who's the hyposensitive, you want to wake him up, you want to get him upright, you want to get him focused and attending, and so you need that bright light. If you've got a Tigger and you overstimulate and you fill the room with lots of visual things, then Tigger's just going to be bouncing off the walls. Tactile hypersensitivity is a really can have a massive impact on function. So tactile hypersensitivity, where the child is oversensitive, there's a long list here and you can read through it later of how it impacts on the child. For me, working with children with tactile hypersensitivity, that's the child that walks in from school and takes everything off. That's the child that is really dysregulated and in school and actually can't cope because they're already insensitive. They're already in a Tigger state, only they're in a fight or flight state. They're on the M25. And so actually the experience of being enclosed is too much. And when they get really distressed, we see children actually removing their clothing. And that's because the tactile hypersensitivity is just another thing that's in that sieve. And so they need to get that trying to regulate by removing clothing. So when you are when your child has got tactile hypersensitivity, deep pressure can help to calm them, and maybe sometimes we use pressure vests and give them extra input. That can work really well. And so there's some strategies here to give you ideas. And obviously being mindful when you're out shopping, being mindful when you're out in busy places, that if a child is tactile hypersensitive, they might be pushed into that fight or flight state by being in too close a proximity to other people. The PowerPoint is actually designed for teaching in school, so there's a lot of references to school, but a lot of these are equally applicable to home. But the child that's tactile hyposensitive, that child often is more vulnerable to sort of other children noticing that after lunch, and Harry's the little boy that doesn't notice his face is dirty. Harry's the little boy that doesn't notice that he's got his shoes on the wrong feet, or he's got his t-shirt on back to front. So these are all things that can draw other children's attention to differences. So it's really important to be sort of working with your child and helping them to try and understand, to be a bit mindful of, you know, making sure that you have a good clean up after you've eaten. And maybe if you need to, if you're in a situation where your child isn't aware of things like that, make sure that school are aware so that they can give that extra support if it's needed. There's some strategies. So strategies you can use at home and at school. I won't go through them all because of time, but they're all there for after. Olfactory, sorry, we're missing I should have picked up on that. We're missing an L. It's actually the olfactory smell, hypersensitivity. So what's interesting about smell is that the receptors for all the other systems go through the midbrain, but the olfactory sense is actually linked to a lot of primitive reflexes. And so olfactory responses tend to be much quicker, and they're also quite often tied in with memories and things like that. So if you are in a situation with your child where you might not even notice the smell. I was out with my granddaughter yesterday and we drove into a car park and she said, "Oh, it smells really funny in here." I hadn't noticed. She is olfactory hypersensitive. So you might not notice things, but what may happen is a child will build an association between a smell and a place, particularly if it's distressing or that smell is too much. So if a child is hypersensitive, these are the children that are going to really struggle in the dining hall in the school. I've seen children who are very hypersensitive and have got maybe tactile things going on who will gag or vomit at the sight or smell of strong foods. So that's something to be a little bit mindful of when you're sort of going out and about to places. Certainly sort of walking through the front of John Lewis where it's all perfumes, that could be really, really distressing. And we showed that briefly in the film that we watched earlier. And there's some strategies to use, and limiting exposure. As I say, always avoid the front of John Lewis if your child is sensitive to smells. It always makes me sneeze, so I tend to try and avoid them. There's certain perfumes. I'm very mindful about wearing perfumes in my working role because for some children, actually, any perfume can be really enough to put them into that fight or flight response and cause distress.
Sorry, Jan, just 10 minutes left.
Brilliant, thank you. I don't know what number slide we're on, actually. Never mind, we'll keep going. So, smell, a child that's under-responsive, that's the child that sniffs things, will pick up and smell everything, won't notice the difference between pleasant and unpleasant smells. And some children will actually play within smear feces if you've got a child that's got really complex needs. And that's because they're seeking that smell. So there's some strategies for hypersensitivity of smell. Children with taste hypersensitivity, that's particularly if it's linked in with smell. Taste hypersensitivity is, I think, for those of us who don't have it, really hard to understand exactly the extent of it. I'm a feeding trained specialist and I've done a little bit of work with children with feeding, and in one of my groups we used to play with food as part of the feeding session, and on one morning I run out of Uncle Ben's rice. So my feeding preparation, I cooked the rice and I put literally a tablespoon of ordinary rice in just to top it up. So it was 99% exactly what the children were used to. I opened the box and the little boy turned around and he said, "There's something wrong with the rice," and he knew it was different. I've certainly heard of examples of people where they've said they've had a safe food, because where you've got children who've got taste hypersensitivity, they're often on limited diets and they have a range of safe foods, and they've had a safe food that the child has suddenly refused to eat, or drink. And I remember hearing an example of Sunny Delight had changed one ingredient. They hadn't even changed it enough that they needed to notify on the label, but that was enough that this particular child, he picked it up, and that safe food became no longer safe, which when you've got a child with a very restricted diet is problematic. Strategies for taste hypersensitivity, just playing with food, using soothing activities before meals, so that you go into mealtime with Winnie the Pooh and not Tigger. You go into mealtime with the child, not in that N25 situation, and being aware of the environment and making sure that it's calm and relaxed and that there isn't pressure, just to try and help support. It's a good way of doing it. Child that's gustatory hyposensitive, taste hyposensitive. Sometimes these children will be prone to something called pica, which is a bit of a nightmare, and some of you may have to deal with that on a daily basis. It's very, very difficult to manage pica where children eat non-foodstuffs. It's also very dangerous. If you've got a child that's got pica and really severe feeding problems, there are specialist centres and you can get referred through your paediatrician. There are specialist centres at Great Ormond Street, Evelina, and I believe it's Addenbrooke's. So if you've got a child where the sensation is affecting function to a point that it's dangerous, it's always worth asking the paediatrician for referral to specialists. That's some strategies. I won't go through them because we are running out of time, but they're there for later on. Again, there's some pictures and ideas for oral motor strategies. So when we talk about oral motor, we talk about using our mouth. That's chewing, crunching, and oral motor is linked to all the senses. So it's linked to obviously taste. It's also linked to proprioception because chewing and crunching gives us a lot of proprioceptive input. There's some more ideas. When it comes to oral motor strategies, it's very, very important to be mindful about what's acceptable with the child. And as the children get older, a chewy chew that might have worked when they were younger becomes less acceptable. And you can get things like pencil toppers that are a bit more discreet and will fit into the environment better. The vestibular system is really important. As I said earlier, the receptors are in the inner ear, and being in the right place from a vestibular perspective is really important for every aspect of our learning. If you've got a Tigger and they're slumped, they're not going to learn as well as someone who's sitting up and focused. It affects gross motor activities posturally. If your posture is not good, it's going to be really, really difficult to ride a bike, to be able to organise yourself for sports and things like that. And it's exactly the same with fine motor skills. If your posture's not good and you are floppy and low tone, it's harder to get into the position to do the things you need to do. So vestibular difficulties have a big impact on function. Hypersensitivity, vestibular hypersensitivity, that's the car sick child. That's the child that's really nervous walking up and down stairs. If your child walks down the stairs using one foot and then the other foot, so walks two-footed, that could be a symptom of a vestibular problem. A child that sort of has frequent falls, it could be vestibular hypersensitivity. And again, it's just helpful to have an idea. I'm very aware that we're really rushing through these slides, so I hope that you'll be able to read through them afterwards and get some extra information. Vestibular underresponsive. I have worked with some children who are underresponsive, and they will literally, they will spin. I had one little boy that literally would, I usually get people to do this, but we haven't got time. So maybe you'd like to do this later. What he used to do was get a shoelace, and he used to hold the shoelace up, and then he would look up, and then he would start to move round and round and round, and then he would move up and down. So he'd be going round and round and up and down. And I often get people doing that when I'm training, because that shows what a sensory seeker he was. He needed that level of vestibular input. When I'm training, I can do about half of one before I start to feel physically sick, and most of the people I know don't do more than two. He would do that for half an hour because he was so sensory seeking. And obviously, if you're that sensory seeking, that's really going to impact on how you learn. So there's some strategies for vestibular hyposensitivity. Most important thing to remember, vestibular top tips. So vestibular top tips, the most important thing to remember is that actually linear vestibular, which is like swings going forwards and backwards, will calm and organise. rotational vestibular, it's very easy to overstimulate a child by using rotation, and then it can be quite hard to get children down. So I use air sensor integration with some of the children I work with, and it can be really, really difficult. You need to be mindful and really, I talk about being a sensory detective a lot of the time. So be very careful about how you use spinning with a child, going on a roundabout and things like that, because it can actually excite a child to a point that they flip into Tigger, and then Tigger is suddenly on the M25. So that's something to be a bit mindful of. Proprioception is our body awareness sense, and that tells us where our bodies are in space. So if you close your eyes and touch your nose, you're using your proprioceptive sense. Poor proprioception really does massively impact on function. It impacts on the way that we regulate and understand. And if a child's got proprioceptive difficulties, that can push them into a Tigger situation, or it can push them into an Eeyore situation because they're floppy, they're low tone, their muscles are not getting the right messages, and so they will then look for additional support. So the impact of proprioception on function is very, very is significant. So there's a long list of how proprioception impacts. Basically, to summarise, if your child's clumsy, doesn't coordinate well, is the child that doesn't get picked out for PE activities, is always the last one picked, is struggling to get dressed in the morning, struggles to do buttons up, that can all be an indication of a proprioceptive difficulty. If you can't organise your fingers and get your pressure right, you're going to really struggle with handwriting. So handwriting is a big indicator of proprioceptive difficulties. When I'm working with children with handwriting difficulties, I talk about them being either my ticklers or my engravers. They'll either press much too hard and break the pencil, or they will literally hardly touch the paper so you can't read it. And that is an indication that there's a proprioceptive problem and they don't know how much pressure that they're using. And there's a lot of strategies there, which again, I'm not going to go through, but they'll be there for you to read afterwards. And there's some proprioceptive activities. So what can we do about sensory processing difficulties in children? Be a sensory detective, understand and be aware of how the sensory processing impacts on everyday life. Most importantly, you work collaboratively with school, and ideally, schools should have access to sensory checklists and make sure that you're aware of the impact on the environment, which is probably something that you already do on an everyday basis. And remember, at school, it's always okay to ask for reasonable adjustments within the school environment if a child's got a sensory processing difficulty. Sensory breaks is something that are incorporated within the school, and I will just leave you to read through that slide. Points to remember: some sensory behaviours can become a behaviour. They start off as a sensory-based thing, and then the child actually sort of integrates them, and then they can become a problem behaviour. So then it can be more difficult to manage. So if you've got a sensory issue, it's easier to deal with it in those early stages. The other thing to remember, which is very annoying, is that children are not oversensitive or undersensitive in different areas. They're oversensitive and undersensitive in all areas and different levels and different days. So it might be that one day your child is in a fight or flight state about, not a hand dry, that's not a good example, but a sound which doesn't bother them on another day. So that can be quite difficult. And emotions can affect sensory processing. So right now, if my dog started barking because of what I'm doing, I would be much more aware of that auditory stimulation than I would be later on when I'm on the sofa with that glass of wine. And that's true for all of us, but it's particularly particularly true for people with autism and sensory processing difficulties. So if your child's having a particularly bad day, it may well be that they are much more hypo, or it's more likely they will be more hypersensitive to different stimuli.
Sorry, Dan, just 1 minute left, and then we have a couple of questions, please.
Brilliant. Right. That's the most important. That's some ideas. The most important thing to remember is that most children with autism have sensory processing difficulties. If your child's got sensory processing difficulties and you can pick it apart and help to understand what's causing them, then you can get strategies in to help with supporting them and work really closely with school, and reasonable adjustments are absolutely. And the other thing, just to say very quickly, is if your child is absolutely brilliant at school, but then it's coming home and you're seeing a lot of challenging behaviours or sensory overload. You need to get back to school, because it's really important that schools understand that a child is a child 24/7, and sometimes children will mask all day long, and then we have the cola bottle effect, where they come out of school and they can't mask anymore and they're really distressed for the evening. So those children need sensory strategies within school to help them to regulate in school, so that they're not struggling when they get home. And I think we're done.